So this is panel 3, and it's thinking about questions of inclusion and exclusion within international orders. And empirically, we could well range from pre-Qin China to the contemporary era, and conceptually, we're going to be focusing on questions such as, and these have been posed by John, of course, whether order can be built without inclusion or exclusion, and how we have typically delineated boundaries of orders. And also something that came up yesterday, how the legitimating principles of orders have been established, if at all. Now, best laid plans of mice and women, I had decided on an order of speakers in consultation with the 4 presenters. And of course, Yan Shui Tong was going to be number 1, but the first speaker, but I'm not sure he's actually yet arrived. So in that case, is that right, John, as far as we can see?
Unfortunately.
So we'll start with Stacey Goddard, the Mildred Lane Kemper Professor of Political Science at Wellesley College. And in fact, one of her major interests is in the relationship between legitimacy and power. Stacey puts a lot of emphasis on the role of rhetoric, and not solely on the challenges to order and order transition in relation to changes in objective capabilities. Her latest book is entitled When Right Makes Might, Rising Powers and World Order, and that's with Cornell University Press 2018. And then we're going to go on to Duncan Bell, Professor of Political Thought, International Relations at the University of Cambridge, a leading analyst of the history of ideas and ideologies of the world order. And he's going to be talking about the significance of race in visions of late 19th century, early 20th century international order. His latest book is entitled Dream Worlds of Race, Empire and the Utopian Destiny of Anglo-America. And that also is with Princeton University Press. Speaker number 3, Kiichi Fujiwara, Professor of International Politics at the University of Tokyo, Director of the Security Studies Unit at Future Initiatives. He's published extensively on war, empire, and conditions of peace, contributing most recently to a volume called A Destabilizing World, as well as The Age of Hiroshima. He's going to be talking today about contested conceptions of territorial space, rights to territorial integrity, along with principal determinants of space and boundaries. And he'll draw on case material from 20th century Japan. And then Yan Shui Tong, we hope, will have joined us at this point, and we will turn to him, and I'll introduce him after that. So 10 minutes each for each presenter, and then a moment perhaps for discussion among yourselves before we turn to questions from the panel audience and then the wider audience. Thank you very much. So Stacey, please.
Thank you so much, Rosemary. And I really want to thank John, Toya, and Chika for organizing this conference. Even at 7 a.m. on a Saturday morning, this is something that it's certainly worth getting up for. And I'm really honored to be included. Now, John, as you saw yesterday, has passed around a number of tasks to the various panel. And our broad task here is talking and thinking about inclusion and exclusion in orders, both in the contemporary liberal international order, as well as in historical orders. So what I want to do today is take on these tasks and talk a bit about principles of inclusion and exclusion, how they've shifted over time in defining what is legitimate or illegitimate behavior in the international system, whether or not they've become more inclusive or exclusive over time, and how it is, as Rosemary mentioned, my work tends to look primarily at rising powers and how it is that rising powers have either accommodated themselves and shifted themselves in order to be included in this order, or how that they have ultimately ended up resisting the substance of these orders. I'm going to try to make kind of 4 broad points. Hopefully they will all fit in, and I won't just try to become incoherent as I smush them into the time period. But so the first observation I want to make is that all orders do place boundaries on what constitutes legitimate behavior in international politics. And because of this, I would argue that orders, regardless of the substance of their rules, are already going to be, to some extent, exclusive. Because when we're talking about orders, we're talking about, and I'll take just John's definition here, the settled rules and arrangements between states that define and guide their interaction. Yesterday, we were talking a lot about Robert Gilpin, and Evelyn brought up the argument that you can also think about Gilpin in general and orders as these social compacts. And I actually think you see this in Gilpin himself. He talks about the rules that kind of underpin order as ranging from the simple understandings regarding spheres of influences, the exchange of ambassadors, the conduct of commerce, the elaborate codification of international law in our own era. So there really is this type of substantive content to order. And to my mind, these really set boundaries on what is acceptable. And it does this because they define what constitute and what counts as legitimate behavior and legitimate action. Okay. So within any international order, we're going to find these social systems that are going to be composed of legitimizing principles, these core norms that establish what counts as acceptable behavior. And of course, these dominant principles are going to vary across time and space, right? There's no one consistent order across time. So arguably keeping the balance was the core legitimating principle of the 19th century continent of Europe. Some would argue that peaceful hegemony, this is David Kang's argument, guided the practices of China up to the 19th century. In the 20th century, we can think about norms of legitimacy ranging from self-determination to making claims based on universal human rights. And all of these are what we say when we're talking about the content of international orders, what constitutes legitimate or illegitimate behavior. Right. As Rosemary mentioned, I tend to be particularly interested in rhetoric and how states use these principles to actually actively legitimate their own behavior. Okay. And this raises the question, I would say, about then if this is how we conceive of orders in part, of having this substantive content, these rules and norms that guide legitimate behavior, how inclusive or exclusive are these orders? And then specifically to John's point, how have they become more inclusive over time? And I really want to highlight this because John can certainly correct me, but I would say that one thing that really permeates his own work is the idea that orders have become more inclusive. And in particular, the liberal international order of today is an order that is far more inclusive than orders of past. This is the line from his book that we all know, I'm sure. These orders are easy to join and hard to overturn, which suggests that in many ways this is inclusive. And what do we mean by that? And I would actually say that when we're talking about inclusivity in orders, what we're really talking about is how permeable the boundaries are. Right? It doesn't necessarily mean that every state's going to be included at any time, but it means whether or not states have the possibility, or any actor has the possibility of joining that order, right? So it's the ability to kind of move into and across those boundaries in the international system. And at the risk of overstating things, I would go ahead and suggest that there are some historical orders that are far more permeable than we oftentimes think about, and conversely, that the liberal international order of today is not quite as permeable as we often talk about. Okay, so again, I will simplify for the sake of time, and I'm happy to take questions on this. I would argue that some of the orders that look the most exclusive had some permeability, right? So to use an example, arguably the continent of Europe system is one, at least on the face of it, is the most exclusive. Its definitions of who gets to participate in the system were quite limited. They were confined to a series of white European great powers who decided on their own that they were accorded certain rights and responsibilities. And Buzan and Lawson obviously do a fantastic job telling us about how the constitution of this great power system within Europe then ended up laying the groundwork for these states practicing domination outside of the continent of Europe. So this very much seems like an incredibly exclusive, incredibly bounded system. At the same time, if you look, for example, at late 19th century, early 20th century Japan, you begin to get a hint of how it is that even these boundaries become permeable. Japan, and I know that some use the word socialized. I actually think it's an extremely strategic position that Japan takes towards this international system, begins to use the rhetoric of the concert system, begins to use the rhetoric of this imperial great power politics in order to legitimate its own behavior, its own expansive behavior, particularly at the end of the 19th century. And this leads to patterns where it's not simply that Japan is recognized as a great power, but it really begins to almost forcefully both persuade and coerce these powers into giving it a seat within the international order. So there's this bit of permeability in the system. And likewise, on the flip side, I think there can be less permeability in the liberal international order, the contemporary liberal international order, than we often think about. I'm working currently on a project, for example, with Ron Krebs, where we talk about the ways in which the liberal international order legitimates itself, the way it talks about its own legitimacy actually leads to more rigid and impermeable boundaries over time. And in particular, liberal international orders tend to develop more fixed ideas about what are legitimate common goods, what should be universal rules. And we can think about legitimate common goods being participating in a free trade system or agreeing to not proliferate nuclear weapons. And over time, we argue the ways in which those are articulate ends up really hardening those boundaries to the point that they too become exclusive and impermeable. Okay. Now, what are the implications of this? Okay, well, this means that any sort of rising power, I argue my work, is going to confront these boundaries. And I argue in many ways they're likely to resist to some extent these boundaries, right? Rising powers are oftentimes likely to come to the table with different ideas about which rules should be governing the international system. Now, that being said, how it is rising powers will end up dealing with and negotiating those boundaries is something that varies quite a bit over time and space. And I'm not going to go into what I see as some of the causes of this. A lot of this depends, I've argued in other work on a rising power and how they're situated with access to resources, and in particular, institutional resources. Do they begin to integrate themselves into existing international institutions? Right. Do they do that and at the same time, for example, build alternative institutions that they can draw from? Right. And this, I argue, can lead to a range of strategies, ranging from full-on integration of the type that many theorists of the liberal international order suspected would happen, to outright resistance and exit, which is something I think we can talk about the Soviet Union actually did as the liberal international order was being constructed, to actually something that I call rules-based revolution. And that is to say strategies where rising powers both take the types of rules and norms that are in the existing international system and begin to combine them in very subtle ways with other types of legitimating strategies. And this arguably, I would say, is something that China has been doing. On the one hand, becoming very much integrated into the liberal international order, but also drawing appeals from outside. Just a final concluding point, because I'm at my 10 minutes, is I think that what this really suggests is that there are important sources of change at the boundaries of international orders, right? That it's here at these boundaries where rising powers exist, that we find these states kind of negotiating change. And I think this raises the questions that we were bringing up yesterday, how we want to conceptualize that. And in particular, do we want to think about kind of more subtle ongoing contestation at the boundaries rather than this type of exogenous shocks that upset the system? Thank you very much. Rosemary, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Well done, me. Anyway, thank you very much, Stacey, and particularly for talking about the hardening of boundaries with respect to the liberal international order. And we turn to Duncan, please, for 10 minutes.
Okay, thanks very much. So thanks to John, Chika and Toya for the invitation to speak, and to Rosemary for organising the panel. I'm not a social scientist and I don't have any general account of the nature of world order and its change over time. My work's concentrated on the intellectual history of world order, of how prominent actors, whether philosophers, politicians, journalists, even fiction writers, imagined the past, present and future. And in particular, I've explored debates in the 19th and 20th centuries about the British and American empires. And so in my 10 minutes today, I'm going to make 3 brief points that draw on that work, but hopefully they might be of some more general interest. The first of the points will be about the importance of racial hierarchy in visions of world order. The second will be on the significance of post-statist and post-imperial ordering projects in public debate discourse, not only in the Anglophone countries, but throughout the world. And the third point will be on the significance of emerging academic disciplines, including political science and international law, in legitimating patterns of inclusion and exclusion. So first, race and world order. I want to suggest that we can think of Euro-American visions of global politics in the 19th century and deep into the 20th as variants of what Paul Gilroy terms raciological ordering. Race, that is, provided an authoritative rationale for manifold forms of exclusion, oppression, and violence. It offered a powerful interpretative grid to categorize and evaluate peoples. Or to follow on from what Stacey was suggesting, one way of thinking about this might be that one of its principal goals was to identify who even counts as a legitimate actor in the international order in the first place. The conclusion, of course, being for many that there were very few legitimate actors due to racial hierarchies. Now, this isn't to suggest that there was a simple agreed upon account of race, particularly in Europe or the Euro-American world. Rather, that the hierarchical ordering of the peoples conducted under the sign of race was near ubiquitous in the public culture and political debate of the dominant global powers. It crossed territorial borders and political ideologies. So it couldn't just be confined, for example, to conservatives or to scientific racists. It transversed pretty much all political ideological boundaries at the time. It intersected in complex and shifting ways with accounts of civilization and later with culture. Indeed, as Alexander Bada orders in his forthcoming book, Global Race War, racial violence and hierarchy were central to the development of modern global order. As he puts it, race and racial hierarchy became the material and ideational scaffold of a global imaginary that took for granted the idea that certain peoples were to be considered naturally inferior and hence exploitable for a wide range of purposes. Plus ça change. This then is the imaginative substratum of many of the debates about ordering that we discussed yesterday. From this perspective, and here I think I build on some of the comments made by Natasha yesterday, we might think of things like traditional shifts in the balance of European power or the rise and decline of particular European empires as of relatively local significance, as long as raciological ordering itself remained pervasive. After all, it might matter to some extent which particular European power is exploiting you, but the most relevant fact is that of exploitation itself. And of course, I should stress here that such raciological ordering visions were not confined to European powers. There's a good literature, for example, on how Japanese conceptions of race played a similar role. But of course, during the long 19th century, it's the Euro-American visions that are dominant globally. So my suggestion here is that accounts of world order, at least in modernity, need to pay close attention to the role of ideologies that divided the world into the so-called superior and inferior peoples, thus legitimating imperialism and the perpetuation of global hierarchies. These underpin, in other words, many of the principles for inclusion and exclusion which we might think about. My second point concerns alternative visions. It can sometimes seem that the majority of world ordering change of the last century and a half has been the shift from a world of empires to a world of sovereign states. But this shift was neither foreordained nor uncontested. Indeed, a striking feature of world-making projects from the late 19th century until deep into the 20th was the amount of attention paid to institutional options that didn't match either straightforwardly. Widely canvassed options included confederations, federal unions, various forms of pan-association, whether based on race, language, or religion, even world states. And of course, some people here, such as Dan, have written widely about this. Such visions were taken by many key political actors at the time as at least viable options for the world to come. Now, some of my own work has tracked fin de siècle arguments about binding together either the British settler empire or the so-called Anglo-Saxons to form a massive omnicompetent polity. But it's important to stress that such visions were not confined to elite debate in Washington or London. Think, for example, of the anti-colonial arguments canvassed by Adam Getachew in World Making After Empire. And nor do these disappear, of course, even in the age of the sovereign state. In the 1970s, there was a burst of thinking, particularly in relation to resource depletion and environmental worries, about how to think of post-sovereign political orders. And I would suggest that we're going through a period at the moment where there's again a resurgence of interest in such things. So the lesson here, I think, is that even though such visions were ultimately not realised, or were realised in only very limited forms, with the possible exception of the EU, we should not forget that concerted thinking that has gone into offering alternatives. Not only would that generate an impoverished view of history, it might also deprive us of resources essential for confronting the future of humanity in the Anthropocene. And my third point is on constructing legitimacy, and in particular, the politics of knowledge. And again, this echoes something that was said far more eloquently yesterday by Natasha. The academic disciplines in which most of us are based, including political science, have for much of their relatively short history been deeply implicated in the legitimation of global hierarchies and patterns of inclusion and exclusion. From the late 19th century onwards, the field was focused on the legitimation of imperial world ordering projects and was preoccupied with both exploring and upholding what Du Bois famously termed the global colour line. So in Robert Vitalis's rendering of this story, this was true deep into the 1960s. This literature on political science parallels that, complements that that's been done on the history of international law in recent years, where a similar dynamic is at play, where international law emerges in large part as a way to help legitimate existing hierarchies and forms of inclusion and exclusion in the international system. So historical accounts of world order thus need to pay close attention to disciplinary histories and to the performativity of social scientific knowledge. To paraphrase sociologist Donald Mackenzie, social science theories were not cameras passively recording the world, but engines actively involved in making it. And so given this history, it seems to me that a high degree of reflexivity and of epistemic humility is warranted in trying to make sense of world order today. Thanks, I'll leave it there.
Powerful and very useful synergies drawn out with Natasha's presentation yesterday. Okay, so Kiichi, please, 10 minutes.
Good morning, and then good evening, and good afternoon to all of you. The title, Inclusion and Exclusion within International Order, and it's an extremely interesting one because this touches upon the issue between several concepts of international order. And one thing that I'd like to discuss would be about borders and territories. Share with you one episode, actually. I've been included in the team of writers for a textbook on civil society or public citizenship for junior high schools for the past 10 years. It is a government directive that in the textbooks we must discuss territory. Well, that was okay with me because there is territory and it should be recognized, and that was okay. But then there was yet another directive that says that the textbook should include the word inherent territory, not just territory, but inherent territory, koyu no ryodo. This was quite interesting for me because I couldn't really see the difference between territory and inherent territory. So we sent out a question to the Ministry of Education, and they told us that this is an inherent territory of a nation. The word nation is quite problematic because nation here is kokumin, which is closer to ethnic nation, but not ethnicity. In other words, this is not about international law. This is not about the right of certain space governed by a certain government that is recognized by others. This is something that includes a combination of territory and identity. The idea of territory, as shown in this very small case, is where a territorial space is defined not only on legal or political terms, but also a sense of a certain community that is the nation. The people is not exactly the word here. And furthermore, this relates to yet another issue. This is not about the intergovernmental relationship as such. This reaches into the idea of a certain community or one definition of a community. And I do not think this is particular to the Japanese case, but nonetheless, this is the case that I can speak a bit more about. The reason why I discuss this is that the order that is implied here is different from the sovereign state system. It is certainly different from the liberal international order as well. We don't have to go into the discussion about the sovereign state system. I doubt if the two treaties in Westphalia defined the sovereign state system. It took much more time than that. I won't go into the details about that, but we are all aware of the sovereign state system, which is not exactly a nation state system. There's a difference here. And the other one about liberal international order, we've been discussing that for some time, sharing of common values, democracy, capitalism, open world, where a border is relativized. And somehow non-Western societies were integrated or participated based on their will and in this given liberal order. And we have a combination of liberalism and hegemony here under the hegemony of Anglo-Saxon nations for more or less about 2 centuries. We have a paradox where a nation that is relatively more open and inclusive was also a world-scale colonial empire and later on an informal empire. This may not be a coincidence. There might be a relationship between the two, but the question is whether this is about domination or leadership, a question that I'll come back later on. A world defined by nation state is somehow different because each communities share certain values that are not shared and defined by culture, tradition, very close to nativism or nationalism. It comes close to the sovereign state, but nonetheless, we can't really talk about national integration. In 1648, it was only after Risorgimento in Italy and the German unification in mid-19th century and nationalism and jingoism, where we see a merger of the nation state system and the sovereign state system. Now here, of course, we see the rise to territorial integrity plus the legitimate use of force as defined by the nation state system in a rather different manner as in the liberal order. The right to territorial integrity is based on a national or ethnic definition of a community, sharing of culture, that is somehow different from the one that we see in international law. The definition of legitimate use of force is not the one that is defined by international law or the sovereign state system. And behind this, we see a request for recognition, the existence of certain communities, and also the legitimacy, not only of governance, but survival of certain communities. And if we discuss about territorial space broad enough in such a manner, it should be quite obvious that this is quite different from the liberal interpretation of international order. A bit about Japan. I won't go into the details, of course. The first primary motivation of Japan's inclusion in the world order was survival, that to escape colonization, centralization of political power was seen to be necessary. And the irony here is that that nation state was not exactly a nation state. It developed into an empire. An empire is in many ways hierarchical, but also quite diverse in its component. The second-class citizens, of course, were the Chinese or the Koreans, but by Chinese I mean Taiwan. But nonetheless, they were part of the subject of the Japanese empire. And the interesting irony is that Japan became a nation state after defeat in World War II, where we see a more genuine, if an eccentric definition of the Japanese nation. Case in point would be the exclusion of Koreans, expulsion, very close, to North Korea, which was a joint venture of the Japanese police and also the Red Cross. And as a matter of fact, Korean communities who identified with North Korea. The irony, and to repeat, is that we see a more simplified definition of the Japanese nation state. Having said that, myself belonging to one of the good old liberals in Japan, there was this UNESCO-like expectation that Japan finally rejoined the global community by defeat, by losing self-destructive and destructive war, and that Japan became a member of the liberal order. Civilization here is in a singular sense. That was not exactly so, because out of this milieu, a more plastic, simplified definition of the nation-state system did emerge. And the interpretation of international law here is very close to Carl Schmitt, not exactly the definition of a liberal international order. I only have 20 seconds, but one thing that I'd like to add to yesterday's discussion is about the role of war and rupture. And I can see that incremental developments in international society has a great deal to do with the idea of order. But nonetheless, I would agree that ruptures or major wars do have an impact in the understanding of the international order. And now, of course, I'm here talking about major wars, the Second World War, for example. But then it depends on how the war is discussed, how the war is perceived. The public memory of the war changes over time. So the defining moment may be the war. The war in Japan would be the Second World War. But nonetheless, the interpretation of the war has been changing. I don't think I have time to go into war memories in Japan, but I would say that rupture is important, but the definition of rupture changes over time. And this was a very short introduction to the re-emergence of a nativist nationalist idea of territory in Japan, which is ironically part of the liberal international order. I should stop here. Thank you.
Much, Kiyoshi, and it just demonstrates how instructive it is actually to think about Japan and Japanese pathways as we contemplate orders, change, exclusivity. So thank you very much for that. I still can't see Yang Shui Tong. I think that's right, unfortunately. I mean, he would have been talking about leadership and his ideas of humane authority. So he would again have added something to the debates about forms of legitimacy and determining legitimacy, with an accent in his case on capabilities. but the extent to which he would talk about the kinds of problematic constructions of legitimation, he could have added obviously a lot on that to the conversation. He may still arrive, but in his absence, can I first of all invite the three presenters just to comment on each other's presentation, if you would like to do that, and then open it up to the wider community to either add your questions into the chat function or to, in terms of the conference panel, to put up, to use the hand function to make your points.
Oh.
Is that right, Talia? Have I got that right?
Yang Shui-Tong just joined us.
Ah, okay. Okay. Hello, Yang Shui-Tong. Well, greetings.
Hi, I think I'm now late. We started at 8:30, right?
8 o'clock.
8 o'clock, yes, we start at 8 o'clock. Now it's 7:38 at Beijing time. I'm late?
I'm afraid so. We've had
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's all right, but you've come in the nick of time because there is time for your 10-minute presentation, and unfortunately you won't have heard the others, but you may be very familiar with their work anyway and have some sense of the points they've made. So please go ahead. If you're ready, please go ahead with your 10 minutes.
I can do it, the presentation now?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Just pretend that you've just run onto stage and everybody's watching you.
I'm sorry, John. You know, I got time at 8 o'clock in Beijing time, so I thought I get here quite early, and I didn't realize that already late. Okay, I will be very brief. Okay, less than 10 minutes. It's okay?
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Well, since this session discusses about the inclusive and exclusive of international order, I will discuss. I will make an argument that whether the international system is of inclusive or exclusive really depends on the power of the leading states. And when the U.S. Becomes the only superpower, and the U.S. has the capability to provide a global leadership, and so U.S. regard the whole world as one club. So when U.S. regard the whole world as one club, so he can adopt the exclusive multilateralism. But now, from my understanding, the world seems to me is moving from the unipolar to a bipolar. So now the U.S. can no longer offer that kind of global leadership like what he did during the post-Cold War period in 1990s. And so the U.S. started to make a step back, like the currently Biden try to establish a lot of exclusive clubs and mainly targeted at China. So that's why now we find that the world order is moving from the inclusive order to exclusive order. And actually during the Cold War, we can find the history just in some way support my argument, because in the Cold War, there's a the bipolarity, and means the US and the Soviet Union share the leadership of the world. Or the other way we can see, neither of the US or the Soviet Union can provide a global, united global leadership. So at that time, they have two blocks. That's just like every block is exclusive, right? Instead of the inclusive. So today, from my understanding, the current bipolarity will continue for at least 20 years, I mean 2 decades. So in the next 2 decades, and neither China nor the US can provide a global leadership as powerful as what the US did in 1990s. So that means that we can no longer turn back to an international order or the inclusive international order like what we experienced in 1990s after the Cold War. So, but China and US have different reasons for adopt the policy and not very supportive to this inclusive international order. From the Chinese side, China do not have that material capability. And without the material capability, China cannot provide that kind of a global, united global leadership. For the US, from my understanding, US Biden have a strong will to resume America's leadership. But at this moment, seems to me it's not that easy because Americans' material capability do not meet the demand or meet the needs of that kind of a global leadership. And if we examine the other differences between China and the US, you can find that and China's policy can hardly to have a group influence. China mainly rely on the bilateral strategic partnership. This is all bilateral, no multilateral strategic partners, because China adheres to non-alliance principle. And the US can organize or set up, build up some group influence. And because America heavily, Biden administration heavily rely on America's alliance. And so it very carefully concerned about the collective interests shared by the allies. But China tried to adopt inclusive and multilateralism. But from my understanding, it's very difficult. Currently, this China-centered multilateral forums like China-Europe, China-Africa, Middle East, Latin America, China-ASEAN, all of this China-centered multilateralism is not bound by any treaty. There's no treaty. And not like America's group exclusive multilateralism with allies, because this kind of policy and based on the agreements with the requirements for members to support collective efforts. So in the next 10 years, I would argue that the international order will be a very possibly and different from what we experienced after the Cold War. And the bipolarity between China and the US will make the international order as a more exclusive rather than inclusive. And meanwhile, along with that kind of order, and the globalization will set back, and the anti-globalization will gain new momentum. And then meanwhile, we'll find multilateralism or the multilateral diplomacy and plays and the less role in foreign affairs. And bilateral diplomacy will become popular, gaining momentum, and becomes more substantial. So I do not want to say which kind of international order is good or bad. I do not want to make the value judgment, but I will say, and there's two types of international orders definitely will require new norms to govern the state's behavior and for the whole world. Okay, that's it.
Okay, thank you very much, Shui-Tong. I haven't introduced you properly. As many of you know, Professor Yang Shui-Tong is at Tsinghua University, where he's also Dean of the Institute of International Affairs, and he's written a number of important books about leadership. The latest is Leadership and the Rise of Great Powers. That was published in the Princeton China series in 2018, I think. And past work, of course, has included ancient Chinese thought and modern Chinese power. And I mention that, Shui-Tong, in part because in that book, you talk a lot about the concept of humane authority, whereas today you've talked a lot about capabilities, actually. and the if you like, the future shape of the world order, which is sort of built around the idea of capabilities either through alliances or through material factors. So I want, perhaps in a broader discussion, we might try and relate some of those thoughts that you've expressed today to this other idea that you've introduced at earlier moments about the necessity for a system of humane authority in order for international order to be stabilized and to persist. But we won't go there right now. We'll perhaps try and draw on that in a bit. Could I just invite members that have spoken to if they would like to engage in a conversation for a few moments before we turn to other participants here.
Well, if possible, I just want to make 1 minute comments about the human authority leadership. Is that okay?
Yes, okay, that's fine.
Okay, very brief. And actually, I make the argument that what kind of order really depends on the types of global leadership. Currently, we cannot have a joint leadership and by China and the US. So that means that we cannot have a certain type of leadership, right? Only when the China and the US provide a joint leadership, and then we can categorize what kind of a leadership it is. But now there's no such kind of leadership. Second, if China and the US want to provide leadership for the world, but then two types of leaderships, and then that also means they have the impact on the international order, maybe make the world order move in the different directions. So that's why at this moment, I think it's difficult for us to categorize what the type of the current international order and current international leadership. The last point is that international authority is based on what? Based on achievements. By now, I doubt either China or the US have achieved that kind of achievements for the world and establish that kind of authority and in today's situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shwetal. So can I invite Duncan, Stacey, and Kiichi as questions that you would like to raise of one another? I wondered, Stacey, whether you had some commentary on Kiichi's points about Japan and its inclusion and the way he's discussed the inclusion of Japan in comparison with your presentation and so on.
To that point, and I think that we are talking about different time periods, and I think it would be interesting to see where we come down if we were talking about the same time period, because Kiichi was talking about Japan coming out of World War II, right? And I think what I would be interested in hearing more about is I think that this is the point where we could drill down into that idea of how it is we actually conceptualize change, right? Because here in your presentation, you very much emphasize the moment of war, right? And what that did. And especially, I really like the point about the narration of war and how this actually ends up feeding into how Japan understands its place in the international system. So how do we want to situate a story that talks about war and this kind of exogenous shock to the system with, again, something that I concluded my presentation on, this kind of negotiation and change. And the only other comment I would say just really briefly that I think we could drill down into is maybe think about, and I think this is coming up in Bob Cohen's question in the chat as well, is what we're actually meaning when we talk about inclusive and exclusivity, right? Because I think that there's a notion of inclusivity is something that says in theory, it could include all the states, all the actors, right? And then there's a notion of inclusivity, and I think this comes close to Andrew Phillips and actually his work with Chris Roy-Smith on actually saying it's about having some sort of pluralism of legitimating principles throughout the international system and allowing some room for contestation, even if we're allowing also for this recognition of difference.
Kiichi, did you want to respond or? And you're muted at the moment.
Yeah, I was muted, sorry. Excellent point. Stacey, thank you. When we discuss about change, there are two things. One thing that we may or may not accept, whether we see international order as hierarchical. The interesting thing about liberal international order is that it can coexist with an unequal distribution of power. After all, distribution of power was never really equal, but the sovereign state system that emerged, at least in 18th century, and if not 17th, Europe, was not based on hierarchy. The idea was that it should be a more or less horizontal state of war. And concept of Europe, again, is not one that includes the idea of hierarchy. And that's where Gilpin is different. In a way, this cross-cuts the realist liberal dichotomy, because John, after all, your understanding of international order is in a way quite hierarchical. But nonetheless, you're not talking about domination, you're talking about leadership. If it's leadership, in other words, if an hegemon can accommodate new members as partners, then there's really no problem about hierarchy. And that's the key issue here, point number one. Point number two is that power distribution changes over time. So, well, after all, when we talk about Japan after World War II, Japan after defeat, it was a very, very weak power. And then it tends to rise with a new economic power. And there is this urge for recognition. And although Japan was part of the liberal international order with an under American hegemony, but nonetheless, the new acquired power required attention and recognition. However, there's yet another concept that, I shouldn't be speaking too much, that I should mix here, whether there is progress in international order. That's an archaic concept, but say, in late 20th century, there was this idea of progress, that international society is moving away from an excessive attention to boundaries, to territorial integrity, to a different order. And that move to the liberal order was supposed to be progress. And that idea was shared by quite a few in Japan, including myself, and not only Japan, I guess. The thing is that there's a reaction against this idea of progress, redefinition of the changes of an international order, and also a redefinition of a liberal international order that comes close to the nation state, where major powers can exert regional hegemony, which may defy international rules that are accepted or enforced by the hegemons. I should stop here.
Okay, thanks very much. Duncan, is there anything you'd like to add, or there's a lot of hands up I can...
I'm all right, actually. I'd be interested to hear what other people have to say.
Okay. And can I turn then in the order I've picked up? Bill, I saw your hand up first, if you could go first.
Yeah, well, thanks for these incredible morning presentations. Really appreciate it. I think, though, I just wanted to draw attention to how, I think Yan Shui Tong has brought back this interaction between material capabilities and order. And this is, of course, central to Gilpin's book that we just started out the conference with yesterday. And as I just wanted to draw out some of, if possible, if you get the time or inclination to draw out some of the other presenters, Duncan, Natasha, in particular, I heard discussing international rules and international norms and international order as essentially expressions of power relationships or dominance relationships. And I'd like to hear to the degree to which you see a disjuncture between these things, that rules actually do constrain power. All I really heard was them expressing power. And that's very consistent with Gilpin, very consistent with the vision of the global order that Jan Shuikan just articulated. Just another quick comment on this idea of the relationship between material capacities, capabilities, and inclusion and exclusion. You know, one other country hasn't been mentioned, one other state or empire that also began in a state of exclusion and ended up in a state of inclusion, and that's Russia. No student of Russian history is not deeply schooled in the long and violent and costly path that that empire took to get from outside to inside the system, ultimately very successfully. But don't forget, it was a long path, and it was one intimately related to its material capacity. So again, we're seeing this interesting interaction between rules and order and material capacity to uphold or challenge or exclude people or exclude actors from that order. And I would love to hear from some of the earlier presenters good stark cases of a disjuncture between these things, a disjuncture between material capacity and inclusion or exclusion.
Yeah, that's important. Can I ask Duncan and Natasha maybe to hold off on comments for now, because there are a number of other questions that are related to this, and actually perhaps this is the moment to bring in Bob Cohane's question, because he has this rather differently, but he's Bob, is your microphone muted? Does anybody know whether Bob can ask his own question?
Rosemary, yes, I can let Bob speak.
Okay.
Bob, we're gonna unmute your mic now. Just giving you a warning of a few seconds. Okay, you can talk now.
Okay, thank you very much. This is a very interesting conference and very interesting presentations, all of them quite stimulating. My question related mostly to Stacy's, although it does relate to others, and that is whether there's a contradiction between the permeability of an order and the strength of its norms. We celebrate often both the permeability of the liberal economic order, of the liberal international order, and the strength of its norms. But the question I have is whether strengthening the norms, such as those governing trade and capital movements, global collaborative institutions like the IMF or others, or human rights, does strengthening those norms necessarily generate exclusionary boundaries by leaving out countries which can't accept the norms?
Thanks very much. I'm going to turn to John now. John Eikenberry.
Yes, I wanted to follow up on that because I'm sort of rising to the question of why liberal order might actually want to have some exclusions. And it's not that I would introduce the term conditionality to kind of sharpen where liberal order might want to put boundaries. It seems to me that part of what provides a kind of structure for relations in a liberal order is that you create a kind of club of like-minded states that want to generate order to pursue social purposes that go beyond what would be a universal standard if everyone were included. And so the club function of order, which doesn't put boundaries based on a specific set of countries that are in and others that are out for all time, but it suggests that to be inside is to buy into a certain set of rights and responsibilities. And indeed, this is, it seems to me, what happened after World War II in the construction of what I would call liberal order 2.0, that in the age of Wilson, it was kind of everybody can come in. There's a hope that people will be socialized, states will be socialized. But after World War II, when there was a kind of a pessimistic view about that public opinion and behavior of a kind of diffuse sort could be shaped, it became much more of a club where to be in was to get rights and responsibilities, protections, a kind of mutual aid society, a kind of logic of conditionality, a kind of slightly softer version of what you see in the EU today. And it seems like there are two purposes for exclusion in a kind of club format. And one is enforcement. if you're in, you're expected to behave in a certain way, and you get benefits from doing so. So it's a kind of backdoor enforcement mechanism. And then secondly, it's a vehicle for achieving social purposes that a larger universe of actors will not buy into. So I guess what I would say is liberal order has both inclusion and exclusion. I think Stacy, I really took her point quite seriously that, you know, there are boundaries on all orders, but that in some ways, and this is an echo of what David Lake wrote in this new issue of International Organization, that orders that are completely open are deeply weak, and that indeed stronger, and this is Bob's point about norms, that stronger orders that have these kind of normative underpinnings almost by definition have to be subsets.
Okay. And now the next three will be, have we lost John at that point?
I'm done.
Okay. Peter, Evelyn, and Barry.
Right. Thank you, Rosemary. This has been a terrific panel. I guess I would like to ask, this actually follows on John's question, and I think in a sense, Bill's. Ask each of our panelists for their thoughts on how this kind of inclusion-exclusion distinction plays itself out politically inside the hegemon and inside the hegemon's kind of international coalition, because it seems to me that it's both critical to understanding how international orders form and also how they unravel. And partly this is driven by an interest in connecting this panel's discussion to the discussion in the second panel yesterday on the discussion on hegemons. But it's also partly an instrumental question. I'll just put my cards on the table. Instrumental because I'm wrapping up a very large cross-national study of the post-war liberal international order with a colleague in Amsterdam, Brian Bragoon. And one of the takeaways from this study that runs from 1950 through 2020 is that the existence of a collective perception of a common threat, that is, countries to be excluded, namely the Soviet bloc, and for a period of time, China, played a really important role in the formation, the duration, and ultimately the erosion of support for liberal internationalism in Western democracies, in the hegemon, but also in Europe and in the democracies in Asia. And it's because it had a kind of disciplining effect politically within these states that made, in a sense, the demands of the hegemon more authoritative and harder to resist politically in the other countries. And in the absence of that threat, and this goes to the point that Shui Tong, I think, has flagged for us, in the absence of, like, the Soviet other, support for liberal order building has weakened in Western democracy one after another. And so what I'm wondering, kind of, Stacy, you unpacked like several different orders where balancing played a role in one, but not necessarily as a norm in the others. Like, whether you see this as a constant thread. Duncan, it would seem kind of almost obvious in your case, because like race and racism played a function in holding together the hegemon as well. But also, I think for Shui Tong, you've talked about the distribution of power, but another version of that is kind of like the distribution of threat, it seems to me. So anyway, kind of a general question to try to connect it in a sense to the conversation yesterday.
speaker, Evelyn.
Thanks, Rosemary, and thank you to the speakers for a really stimulating panel. Lots of thoughts in my head, but I'll confine myself to two, I think. First is this question about point of view, right? I think that the presentations have made very clear that, you know, it does look very different thinking about inclusion or exclusion, whether it's a spectrum or sort of an either or. Depending on whether you're talking from the core, let's use this language from yesterday's first panel, or if you're talking from the periphery of the existing order. And the view from the periphery is one of, you know, shades of gray, right? It is permanent partial exclusion. Whereas the view from the periphery, from the core, I think, tends to be an either or. And much of this conversation, I think, has centered on from the point of view of the core to some degree, which segues into my second point, following on from Bill's observation about Russia and this idea of some degree of fluidity, right, of great powers, potential challenges, and so on and so forth, being at various different junctures, being sort of included and excluded, but actually being able to move between the two as well. And I wonder if there might be, in the discussion of contemporary China, you know, and a bit of an idée fixe by this point that, you know, China's not at the heart of the existing order. Yesterday, I think in maybe it was in the second panel at some point, one of the speakers made, you know, that insightful reminder that, you know, basically we got system change when China decided to join the international order in the late 1970s, 1980s onwards. And I think that's broadly right. So China's risen within the heart of this order. And at this point, you know, what we're looking at is a bit of that process that John's begun to talk about, right? That point where the club decides to exert boundaries, right? And that led me to think whether we might be able to think about sort of exclusionary processes in conjunction with power at that core in that club, and related to those processes of potential rupture type change that we talked about yesterday. So sort of pegging on those three things together to make sort of a causal chain to some degree. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Evelyn. Barry, would you like to?
Thanks, Rosemary. I mean, I have a comment mainly directed to Kiichi's presentation. I thought the idea of using Japan as a case of encountering international orders was really good. But I thought you might have some advantage from looking at this through an English school framework, in the sense that if you look at what it is that constitutes the dominant actors in a system. I mean, the Westphalian state was basically resting on three institutions, and indeed most of the empires in pre-modern times, which was to say sovereignty, territoriality, and dynasticism, with dynasticism very much defining the nature of territoriality and sovereignty. When you get the shift into modernity in the 19th century, you get the modern state where nationalism displaces dynasticism and redefines territoriality and sovereignty. And that was a process that Japan went through in a very explicit and well documented way. And then you could also think about a postmodern state, which might or might not still be in the making, but being experimented with for the last several decades, which would be an attempt to add the market as another foundational institution for the state. This hasn't entirely worked out, but it has been the story of the last several decades, and is still being contested as to whether the market or economic nationalism is going to be, as it were, the institution. But I think you could use that framing to quite good advantage in thinking about the Japanese case.
Thanks, Barry. I turn to Tolia next, and then after that, Dan Lloydney, after Tolia.
Thank you so much, Rosemary. Just seconding the earlier remarks on how wonderful this panel was. I really enjoyed the presentations, and I wanted to put two specific questions, one to Stacey and Duncan. The question for Stacey is, I really like the way that you refigured the conventional discussion about choices between inclusivity and exclusivity into this kind of a more gradual framework of degrees of permeability. Instead of thinking about inclusivity and exclusivity as these binary opposites, we need to think about degrees of permeability. I think that's very powerful. It's very helpful. I wanted to ask you for a more detailed explanation of the causal antecedents that explain changes in the degree of permeability at a point in time. In particular, some of the remarks that you made suggest that you have a more strategic conception of the antecedents of permeability in mind. So for example, you spoke about the access to resources and participation in common institutions as determining permeability. But at other times, it sounded like the understanding is more normative. And so I just wondered if you could elaborate on how these different elements relate to one another for you, and whether there is a kind of a sense of causal priority that's accorded to either the strategic or the normative elements. And the question to Duncan is, Duncan, you mentioned a number of alternative visions that existed, especially in the first half of the 20th century, for organizing the international system and carrying it forward during the transition, what we now know was the transition from the world of empires to a world of nation states. I wonder if you could clarify the point about that diversity. Is it primarily a point about the quantitative diversity of those imaginaries and those visions? So the different ideas for organizing the international space, irrespective of how practicable those visions were? Or is it a more qualitative point that under conditions of modernity, there was indeed a number of different pathways in which the international system could be taken forward very practicably, and the particular destination at which it arrived was in that sense not predetermined? So is it a sense of a quantitative diversity or a sense of qualitative practicable diversity? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Toya. So Dan.
Let's see here. This has been terrific for me, very educational. I have an observation, comment, kind of challenge question. Going back to the overall reimagining world order, future, present focus from a standpoint of a world of high levels of interaction, interdependence, and vulnerabilities. And I'm struck in hearing this conversation, very erudite and insightful, is that the word cosmopolitan never appears. And my query, my interrogation here to Duncan and to Stacy and to others, this language of imaginary. And of course, Duncan, as in his work on Wells, has obviously, already been saying things about this. The imperatives of interdependence as creating a new reality for a universalism. That this has been, part of the discursive conversation across the last 2 centuries, and it's been intensifying. And my observation from my own work is that the characterization, and this was a conversation, I guess, with Chris in the last panel, human rights cosmopolitan has been the sort of dominant rubric, which is based on ethical universalisms and claims of human species right-bearing claims, that this is misleading in a fundamental way, a fundamentally mismatched, a kind of not really appropriate prism with which to understand the types of universalistic identity claims that we have increasingly had made. And the language that I propose to capture this new is terrapolitan. It's not a conversation about realizing abstract universals. It's instead a conversation about building a polis that is matched to the constraints and opportunities of terra, of the earth.
Thanks very much, Dan. I have Chris and then Arnie. Chris Reutzmeier.
Yeah, a great panel. I just wanted to come back to the question of, inclusion in the liberal international order, and just expressed some concerns about using human rights as an example for talking about this. In particular, the idea that you need a thicker liberal international order comprising liberal rights observing states, and that's how you get observance of human rights, and that if you have a broader international order, that becomes more difficult to prosecute such rights and protect them. This seems to, in the case of human rights, does seem to problematize some of this discussion about the liberal order and inclusion and exclusion, because it strikes me that at the high point of the liberal international order, let's say in the period from in the first phase, John's 2.0, after the Second World War, you have a situation where you've got three anomalies. One, of course, is that some of the leading liberal states, the United States in particular, was an egregious human rights violator. In the case of civil rights of African Americans, that doesn't change until the 1960s, and then only partially. And then, of course, you've got empires, liberal empires, that were in the process of also violating human rights systematically, and were also using their influence in international forums to actually try to water down the human rights instruments that were being negotiated. And many of the strengths of those instruments were actually produced by states that were not liberal states, but were emergent post-colonial states. And then, of course, we've got the kind of politics that Catherine Sicking talks about, which is about the transnational politics, which connected up actors that weren't states in advancing human rights. So it strikes me that while there may be certain issue areas where we can talk about, that sort of thicker club of liberal states as being essential to the prosecution of certain liberal values, I think human rights is not. I would caution about using human rights as an example of that. That was simply a point that I wanted to put out there.
It's helpful. Arnie, please.
This is very interesting. And it's a very good follow-up to the discussions that we had yesterday. Mine really comes off Peter's point and some of what John said, and it's about the disciplining qualities of otherness within international orders. This is something that struck me when I went from working on the Cold War era to looking at China-Japan relations in the early modern setting. How significant that is in terms of the establishment of a lasting order. So in the relationship between China and Japan and Korea, of course, the definition of Japan as the other, as the outsider, had a tremendously disciplining character with regard to how the Ming international system developed, particularly with regard to Korea, but also further afield. In many ways, quite similar to the role that the Soviet Union had, both in Europe and I would argue to some extent in East Asia during the Cold War. But there is a particular point to this which makes it not just about general otherness or general definitions of outsiders. There's a point that Jiang Feng makes when he looks at the Ming international order. And that is that in many of these cases, the definition of the other or the outsider or the threat has to be someone who is expected to be on the inside when these systems start up. I mean, this is John's point, right? So with regard to the Soviet Union, after the end of the Second World War, being expected to join, at least in some form, that international order that was set up as a result of the war. Very similar to the Neo-Confucian Revolution in the late 14th century, when Japan was expected to be on the inside, sharing many of the same values, and then turning out not to be that, which made the hegemon's argument of this being an existential threat to the system, Japan in the 14th and 15th century, the Soviet Union during the Cold War, so much more effective. And of course, this brings up a lot of questions because you can see some of the parallelities here with regard to China's position today. Not being an outsider, defined as an outsider from the very beginning,
but one that is expected to join the international system. And then in the definition of the leading power is said not to do so, rather trying to destroy the system from the inside.
Thanks very much, Arnie. In the last 10 minutes, I'm going to return to the presenters and ask them to respond to a really very rich set of comments. And it's a mark of how important these papers are, I think, that it's generated such an important discussion and built on, of course, a lot of what happened yesterday. So since Jan Shui-Tong, you have your hand raised anyway, shall I start with you if you would like to respond to some of these points?
Thank you very much. I just want to add one point. And when we discuss about the international order, I find that sometimes we really need a distinction between the two aspects of the international order. First is the state of the order. That means existence of the order, or there's no order. So from my understanding, in most of cases, people define the international order in terms of the state. That means settle down disputes peacefully without military violence. So that all means states behave themselves according to norms. And the other aspect of discussion about the international order is a character of the international order. That means whether order of a prison, or order of university, or order of the hospital, or order of the library. So you see, there's a different characters of different type of the international orders. So just now when Peter said that, and this kind of exclusive order is a kind of threat to the order. My understanding of that means exclusive international order is a threat to the global order, the order of the whole system. That means the existence of the peace. And actually, I fully agree with that. But now at this moment, because of the nuclear weapons, for most people believe the major war or the grand war has a very little chance to happen. So now people discuss about and what kind of new characters for the coming international order, how different the character from what we experienced during the Cold War, not during Cold War, after the Cold War. So at this moment, I will say, and the coming order, I'm not so sure will be the bad than the what order we experienced, for instance. And maybe the character is a difference, but then it seems to me there will be less military clashes in the coming decades than we see in the 1990s, the first decade of the post-Cold War. So if the character is not that nice to our normal standard, I mean, so human rights, but it really reduces military violence. That's, from my understanding, that's also is a choice. And so when we're talking about, when we use the human rights as the only criteria to judge international order, it may mislead us to understand what kind of order is most suitable for the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Duncan, would you like to respond to some of the comments?
Yeah, thanks. So there's quite a lot to get through. So maybe I'll just mention 3 points. The first is about the relationship between constraint and the expression of power, which I guess goes to Bill's comment. So in relation to the late 19th, early 20th century, at least, think of a couple of examples in which the raciological ordering of the world that I mentioned cashes out in both constraint and in terms of radical difference in terms of legitimating principles globally, the two being tightly connected. So the first is something like power transition between Britain and the United States. So why was there no major war? Discussed widely by many thinkers, including Gilpin, of course, but at least to my mind, probably the most convincing account of this is being given by Sir Jan Vuketic, his kind of constructivist account of racialized identities in international relations. So you don't have to think that race is by any means all of the story here, but there's no doubt that the interrelation between Britain as a great power and the United States as a great power was heavily shaped by perceptions of racial similarity between elites on both sides of the Atlantic. At the same time, if you think about the history of the laws of war at the time, what you'll find here is that racial similarity in terms of a kind of meta principle of white supremacism that would include European powers too, leads to a set of constraints that are then enacted in law regulating warfare, which are explicitly not applied outside of the domain of the civilized or outside of the Euro-Atlantic world. So for example, it's legal to use exploding bullets in colonial conflicts against non-white peoples, but it's regulated and banned in intra-European warfare. It's pretty hard to escape the kind of color line playing an absolutely explicit role in this. So this is how it was justified at the time by medical professionals, by lawyers, and so on and so forth. So you get there simultaneously these kind of, what I would think of almost as a meta-ordering principles, facilitating constraint on the one hand between certain groups of people regarded as legitimate actors within the system, and those that are considered illegitimate or inferior, sometimes even subhuman, on the other. There's a separate point which Bill points to, and that's a kind of, I guess, theoretical stroke methodological one about how you think about the relationship between material and ideational factors. Obviously, people are going to differ a lot on that. You know, if you're coming from, say, the Black Marxist tradition, adopting a kind of racial capitalism thesis a la Cedric Robinson, you're going to have a very different view about the role of the state, let alone a material power, from if you were, I don't know, a kind of constructivist IR scholar who's focusing principally on kind of legitimated strategies within the state and in which capitalism doesn't necessarily play such a big role. So people will differ very much over how they think about that. I mean, my own perspective is a kind of realism. I do think that power matters enormously in these kind of things, but I'm also much more, I guess, constructivist, broadly speaking, in my orientation than maybe some others here. But I think from whichever perspective you come, these arguments about race should be taken seriously, whether they're just read as a kind of superstructural or epiphenomenal post hoc rationalizing feature, or whether you see them as constitutive in some much deeper sense. Second point is about the idea of progress. So here I can point to, at least in terms of liberal ideology, a way in which, if we adopt a kind of dynamic perspective on these questions, the relationship between inclusion and inclusion cashes out when you build in a notion of progress. So in the 19th century, the standard liberal imperial argument, someone like John Stuart Mill would be making it, but it would be held by many key political actors too, would be that, for example, empire is legitimate if and only if it benefits those who are subjected to it. So the British Empire is legitimate in India because it benefits Indians. How does it benefit them? It helps to civilize them. They are of an inferior social and political order, but the empire can play a civilizing role. And at some point in the future, usually infinitely deferred, kind of waiting room view of history that Deepesh Chakrabarty talks about, but nevertheless, in principle, in the future, they can be included within the system because they reach the point where they have become a civilized people through tutelage. That usually means that they have something like a national identity, which can then claim political self-determination. So the end point of this kind of vision is an inclusive international liberal order. But the way that you get there starts from a much more exclusive picture. And so over time, and this is just called progress on these kind of views, you get the expansion of the boundaries. So that's how I think progress, at least in ideological terms, plays a key role in thinking about inclusion and exclusion in some very powerful ideologies in the 19th century. And then finally, Toya, about what's the point of taking seriously, if we must, these alternative visions. I don't think there's a single reason. I think one would just be for the sake of doing good history, as it were, at least good intellectual history, to recognize that there was considerable contestation over what will count as a viable future order or a desirable future order through most of the period that we're talking about. But that this rises in levels of popularity at particular points in time. Second World War, for example, was a key moment for thinking these terms. 1970s was a key moment. I would suggest today is one, and the late 19th century would be another, just to pick some. In terms of whether they were feasible or not, I mean, I think people will disagree over this. My own view is that some were certainly more feasible than others, and world state never seemed to be particularly on the cards, but certainly regional federations or various forms of pan-organization were tried out in some cases, or were seen as viable by many key political actors at the time. Think of say Fred, what's his name, NYU historian Fred Cooper's work on post-Second World War African history, and you'll get a sense of how this was a kind of live issue at the time. So yeah, I wouldn't say they were all equally plausible, but nor would I dismiss them all as kind of pure fantasy either. So I think there's various reasons we should take these alternatives seriously. But I think I'll leave it there. Others need to talk.
Thank you. John, I realise that we've now reached our time, but I obviously would want to get in Kyuchi and Stacey. Is it
Yes,
okay?
I think we should let them each have a minute or so.
Two or 3 minutes each, yeah, or a couple of minutes each. So perhaps Kyuchi, would you like to go first?
Just a minute. Great panel. As to the question about, boundaries and exclusivity in liberal international order, John's point and Stacey's point, excellent. It all depends on how boundaries and membership is defined. Yet another question about expulsion and abandonment. Some powers may leave, or otherwise some powers may be kicked out. Whenever that happens, and then the legitimacy of the order may be maintained, but the strength of that order would be severely challenged. Yet another point, a point raised by Barry, excellent indeed. The changes to the modern state actually accompanies a wide number of people participating in the process. This invites possibility of a new form of authoritarianism within democratic institutions. So it's not really intergovernmental, and that's the issue that we may be facing right now. But I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kyuchi. Stacey, please.
Really briefly, because I know I'm standing between people and coffee. First of all, to the question of liberal orders, and particularly Professor Cohen's question about thicker norms. Yes, thicker substantive norms, I do think make things more exclusive. But one thing I want to question, are weak orders bad? People were putting this out there. It's like, well, all we can get is a weak order. If we're talking about, when we talk about weak orders, if we're saying perhaps moving away from an incredibly legalized and rigid order, right? One that assumes that there are universally recognized common goods that can be applied to everybody, and instead leaving space for different political communities and contestation over the common good, maybe in the end that is not maybe a stronger order, but a more resilient one. So perhaps we should actually work through that. I agree with everything Duncan said on material power. So I actually just want to move on finally to Toya's question about permeability. And it's not something, I don't think I have well-developed thoughts on it, but I think ultimately we have to think of this as both a strategic and a normative process. And the way I often think about it are that it is strategic. We're going to find actors attempting to negotiate their way across those boundaries, but to get that, they have to have access and be able to perform within the legitimate boundaries of that order, if that makes sense.
Okay, thanks very much. So I'll draw it to a close now, John, and just say it has indeed been a very stimulating period, hour and a half, and thank you all very, very much for your contributions. So,
Thank you, thank you. So I think we'll add 5 minutes to the next panel, but we'll give 5-minute break now and come back at 20 to the hour. So we'll have 5 minutes, a sharp 5 minutes. So we really will start in 5 minutes, and we'll see you then.